Lynn Abbey. Planeswalker. Magic: The Gathering. Artifact Cycle. Book 2. Chapter 1. A man descended. His journey had begun in the clouds, riding the winds, in search of a place remembered but no longer known. He'd found the place as he'd found it before, by following the ancient glyphs an ancient folk had carved into the land. Glyphs that had endured millennia of neglect and the cataclysmic finale of the Brothers' War 5 years ago. Much of treachery had vanished in the cataclysm, reduced to dust by fratricidal hatred. That dust still swirled overhead. Everyone coughed and harvests were sparse, but the sunsets and sunrises were magnificent. Luminous streaks of amber reaching across the sky, seeking escape from a ruined world. The brothers in whose names the war had been fought had been reduced to curses by Urza's whim and Mishra's might. May you rot forever beneath the forests of sunken Argoth. Rumors said that Urza had caused the cataclysm when he used laudanum sorcery to fuel his final, most destructive artifact. Others said that the cataclysm was Mishra's curse, as he died with Urza's hands clasped around his throat. A few insisted that Urza had survived his crimes. Within a year of the cataclysm, all the rumors had merged in an increasingly common curse: if I met Urza on the road, I'd cripple him with my own 2 hands, as he and his brother crippled us, then I'd leave him for the rats and vultures. As he left Mishra, Urza had survived. He'd heard the curse in its infinite variations. After nearly 5 years in self-chosen exile, the erstwhile Lord Protector of the realm had spent another year walking amongst the folk of blasted treachery, the dregs of Yosha, the survivors of Argive, the tattered, the famished, the lame, the disheartened. No one had recognized him. Few had known him, even in the glory days. Urza had never been one to harangue his troops with rhetoric. He'd been an inventor, a scholar, an artificer such as the world had not seen since the Thran, and all he'd ever wanted was to study in peace. He'd had that peace once, near the beginning, and lost it, as he'd lost everything to the man the abomination his brother had become. A handful of Urza's students had survived the cataclysm. They'd denounced their master, and Urza hadn't troubled them with a visit. Urza's wife, Kayla Krug, had survived too. She now dwelt in austere solitude with her grandson, writing an epic she called the Antiquity Wars. Urza hadn't visited her either. Kayla alone might have recognized him, and he had no words for her. As for her grandson, Jarsel, black-haired and stocky, charming, amiable and quick-witted, Urza had glimpsed the young man just once, and that had been one time too many. His descent continued. Urza had not wanted to return to this place where the war had, in a very real sense, begun nearly 50 years earlier. He wasn't ashamed of what he'd done to end the war. Filling the bowl-shaped cilix with his memories had been an act of desperation. The cilix itself had been a sudden, suspect gift, and until that day he'd neither studied nor practiced sorcery. He hadn't known what using the cilix would do, but the war had had to be stopped. The thing his brother had become had to be stopped, else Tiresias's fate would have been worse. Much worse. No, Urza would not apologize, but he was not pleased by his own survival. Urza should have died when the cilix emptied. He suspected that he had died, but the power stones over which he and his brother had contended had preserved him. When Urza had awakened, the two Thran jewels had become his eyes. All Thran devices had been powered by such faceted stones, but his might stone and Mishra's weakstone had been as different from ordinary power stones as a candle to the sun. Once rejoined within Urza's skull, the Thran jewels had restored him to his prime. He had no need for food or rest, though he continued to sleep because a man needed dreams, even when he no longer needed rest. And his new eyes gave him vision that reached around dark corners into countless other worlds. Urza believed that in time the battered realms of treachery would recover, even thrive, but he had not wished to watch that excruciatingly slow process, and so he'd walked away. For 5 years after the cilix engendered cataclysm, Urza had explored the round-the-corner worlds. His faceted eyes revealed. In one such world he'd met another traveler, a woman named Meshuvil, who'd confirmed what he'd already guessed. He'd lost his mortality the day he destroyed Mishra. The blast had slain him, and the Thran power stones had brought him back to life because he had always been a planeswalker, like Meshuvil herself. Meshuvil explained to Urza that the worlds he'd visited were merely a handful of the infinite planes of the multiverse, any of which could be explored and exploited by an immortal planeswalker. She taught Urza to change his shape at will and to comprehend thought without the inconvenience of language or translation. But even among planeswalkers, Urza was unique. For all her knowledge, Meshuvil couldn't see the multiverse as Urza saw it. Her eyes were an ordinary brown, and she'd never heard of the Thran. Meshuvil could tell Urza nothing about his eyes, except that she feared them, and feared them so much that she tried to snare him in a time pit. When that failed, she fled the plane where they'd been living. Urza had thought about pursuing Meshuvil more from curiosity than vengeance, but the plane she'd called Dominaria, the plane where he'd been born, the plane he'd nearly destroyed, kept its claws in his mind. 5 years after the cataclysm, Dominaria had pulled him home. Urza's descent ended on a wind-eroded plateau. Clouds thickened, turned grey. Cold wind, sharp with ice and dust, plastered long strands of ash-blonde hair across Urza's eyes. Winter had come earlier than Urza had expected. Another unwelcome gift from the cilix. A few more days and the glyphs would have been buried until spring. 4 millennia ago, the Thran had transformed the plateau into a fortress, an isolated stronghold wherein they'd made the final stand. Presumably, it once had a name, perhaps the glyphs proclaimed it still, but no one had cracked that enigmatic code, and no one cracked it that afternoon. Urza's jeweled eyes gave him no insight into their maker's language. 50 years ago, in his natural youth, Urza and his brother had named the Great Cavern within the plateau Koilos, and Koilos it remained. Koilos had been ruins then. Now the ruins were themselves ruined, but not merely by the cilix. The brothers and their war had wrought this damage, plundering the hollow plateau for Thran secrets, Thran power stones. In truth, Urza had expected worse. Mishra had held this part of treachery for most of the war, and it had pleased Urza to believe that his brother's allies had been more destructive than his own allies had been. In a dusty corner of his heart, Urza knew that had he been able to ravage Koilos, even the shadows would have been stripped from the stones, but Mishra's minions had piled their rubble neatly. Almost reverently, Their shredded tents still flapped in the rising wind. Looking closer, Urza realized they'd left suddenly and without the belongings, summoned, perhaps, to Argoth, as Urza had summoned his followers for that final battle 5 years earlier. Urza paused on the carefully excavated path. He closed his eyes and shuddered as memories flooded his mind. He and Mishra had fought from the beginning in a sunlit Argive nursery. How could they not, when he was the eldest by less than a year and Mishra was the brother everyone liked better? Yet they'd been inseparable, so keenly aware of their differences that they'd come to rely on the other's strengths. Urza never learned the arts of friendship or affection because he'd had Mishra between him and the rest of the world. And Mishra? What had he given Mishra? What had Mishra ever truly needed from him? How long? Urza asked the wind in a whisper that was both rage and pain. When did you first turn away from me? Urza reopened his eyes and resumed his trek. He left no footprints in the dust and snow. Nothing distracted him. The desiccated corpse propped against one tent pole wasn't worth a second glance, despite the metal plates rusting on its brow or the brass pincers replacing its left arm. Urza had seen what his brother had become. It wasn't surprising to him that Mishra's disciples were similarly grotesque. His faceted eyes peered into darkness, seeing nothing. Now, that was a surprise and a disappointment. Urza had expected insight the way a child expects a present on New Year's morning. Disappoint Mishra and you'd have gotten a summer tantrum, loud, violent and quickly passed. Disappoint Urza and Urza got cold and quiet, like ice, until he'd thawed through the problem. After 4,000 years had they plundered the last Thran past and exposed the last artifact. Was there nothing left for his eyes to see? A dull blue glint caught Urza's attention. He wrenched a palm-sized chunk of metal free from the rocks and rubble. Immediately it moved in his hand, curving back on itself. It was Thran, of course. An artificer of Urza's skill. Didn't need dual dyes to recognize that ancient craftsmanship. Only the Thran had known how to forge a sort of sentience between motes of metal. But Urza saw the blue-grey metal more clearly than ever before. With time, the right tools, the right reagents, and a bit of luck, he might be able to decipher its secrets. Then, acting without deliberate thought, as he very rarely did, Urza drove his right thumbnail into the harder-than steel surface. He thought of a groove, a very specific groove that matched his nail. When he lifted his thumb, the groove was in the metal and remained as he slowly counted to 10. I see it. Yes, I see it. So simple, once it can be seen. Urza thought of Mishra, spoke to Mishra. No one else, not even his master-student Tauros, could have grasped the shifting symmetries his thoughts had imposed on the ancient metal. As if it had been your thumb, Urza conceded to the wind. Impulse, like friendship, had been Mishra's gift. Urza could almost see him standing there, brash and brilliant, and not a day over 18. An ice crystal died in Urza's lashes. He blinked and saw Mishra's face, slashed and tattered, hanging by flesh threads in the cogs of a glistening engine. Phyrexia. He swore and hurled the shard into the storm. It bounced twice, ringing like a bell, then vanished. Phyrexia. He'd learned that word 5 years ago, the very day of the cataclysm, when Tauros had brought him the cilix. Tauros had gotten the bowl from Ashnod, and for that reason alone, Urza would have cast it aside. But he'd fought Mishra once already that fateful day. For the first time, Urza had poured himself into his stone, the might stone, and if his brother had been a man, his brother would have died. But Mishra had no longer been a man, he hadn't died, and Urza needed whatever help fate offered. In those chaotic moments, as their massed war engines turned on one another, there'd be no time to ask questions or consider implications. Urza believed Mishra had transformed himself into a living artifact, and that abominable act had justified the cilix. It was after, when there was no one left to ask, that the questions had surfaced. Tauros had mentioned a demon, a creature from Phyrexian, that had ambushed him and Ashnod. Never mind the circumstances that had brought Urza's only friend and his brother's treacherous lieutenant together on the Argoth battlefield. Tauros and Ashnod had been lovers once, and love, other than an abstract devotion to inquiry or knowledge, meant very little to Urza. Ask her instead, what was a Phyrexian doing in Argoth? Why had it usurped all the artifacts, his and Mishra's? Then, ask her final question. What had he or Mishra to do with Phyrexia that its demon had become the common enemy? Some exotic force, some Phyrexian force, had conspired against them. Wandering utterly alone across the ruins of treachery, there had seemed no other explanation. In the end, in the forests of Argoth, only the cilix had prevented a Phyrexian victory. Within a year of the cataclysm, Urza had tracked the cilix back through Ashnod's hands to a woman named Lauren, whom he'd met in his youth. Though Lauren had studied the Thran with him and Mishra under the tutelage of the archaeologist Kayla, she'd turned away from artifice and become a scholar in the ivory towers of Teresia City. Witness of the land-based power the cilix had unleashed, the residents of Teresia City had sacrificed half their number to keep the bowl out of his or Mishra's hands. Half hadn't been enough. Lauren had lost the cilix and the use of her right arm to Ashnod's infamous inquiries, but the rest of her had survived. Urza had approached Lauren warily, disguised as a woman who'd lost her husband and both her sons in what he bitterly described as the brothers' cursed folly. Lauren was a competent sage and a better person than Urza hoped to be, but she was no match for his jeweled eyes. As she'd heated water on a charcoal brazier, he'd stolen her memories. The cilix, of course, was gone, consumed by the forces it had released, and Lauren's memory of it was imperfect. That was Ashnod's handiwork. The torturer had taken chances with her many victims. Lauren recalled a copper bowl incised with Thran glyphs Urza had forgotten until he saw them again in Lauren's memory. Some of the glyphs were sharp enough that he'd recognize them if he saw them again, but most were blurred. He could have sharpened those memories, his eyes had that power, but Urza knew better than to make the suggestion. Lauren would sooner die than help him, so they drank tea, watched a brilliant sunset, then went their separate ways. Urza had learned enough. The Thran, the vanished race who'd inspired his every artifact, had made the cilix, and the cilix had saved Dominaria from Phyrexia. Although mysteries remained, there was symmetry, and Urza had hoped that symmetry would be enough to halt his dreams. He'd resumed his planeswalking. It had taken 5 years. Urza was nothing if not a determined, even stubborn, man before he'd admitted to himself that his hopes were futile. A year ago, he'd returned to Dominaria, to Argoth itself, which he'd avoided since the war ended. He'd found the ruined hilltop, where he'd unleashed the land's fury and pain. He'd found Tauros' coffin. Tauros had spent 5 years sealed in stasis within the coffin. For him, it was as if the war hadn't yet ended and the cataclysm hadn't yet happened. The crisp images on the surface of Tauros' awakened mind had been battlefield, chaos, Ashnod's lurid hair, and the demon from Phyrexia. If this thing is here, Tauros had recalled his erstwhile lover's, one-time torturer's words. Ashnod's statement had implied, at least to Tauros and from him to Urza, that she'd recognized the demon, a man. Tall construction of strutted metal and writhing, segmented wires. Urza recognized it too, or parts of it. He'd seen similar wires uncoiled from his brother's flensed body, attaching Mishra to a dragon engine. "This one is mine." More of Ashnod's sultry words, lying fresh in Tauros' mind. Urza's only friend had wanted to argue with Ashnod to die beside her. She wouldn't grant him that dubious honor. Instead, she'd given him the cilix. Tauros' memories had clouded quickly as he'd absorbed the vastly changed landscape. While Tauros had sorted his thoughts, Urza had looked westward to the battlefield now, replaced by ocean. Ashnod, as treacherous as she'd been beautiful, had betrayed everyone who fell into her power. Tauros' back still bore the scars. Mishra had judged her so unreliable that he'd banished her, only to let her back for that last battle. Or had he? Had Mishra known Ashnod carried the cilix? Had the traitor himself been betrayed? Which was the puppet and which the master? Why had the demon stalked Ashnod across the battlefield? What was her connection to Phyrexia? Urza had wrestled with such questions until Tauros had asked his own. "Your brother dead?" Urza had replied as his questions converged on a single answer. Long before why found him. The words had satisfied Tauros, who began at once to talk of other things, of rebuilding the land and restoring its vitality. Tauros, dear friend, Tauros had always been an optimist. Urza left him standing by the coffin, certain that they'd never meet again. For Urza, the realization that he hadn't slain Mishra with the cilix had given him a sense of peace that had lasted almost a month, until a new, stronger wave of guilt had engulfed it. He was the elder brother, charged from birth with his younger siblings' care. He'd failed when Mishra had need of an elder brother's help. That elder brother had been elsewhere. He'd failed Mishra and all of Dominaria. His brother had died alone, betrayed by Ashnod, transformed by a Phyrexian demon into a hideous amalgam of flesh and artifice. Urza had returned to Argoth and Tauros as the snows had begun, almost exactly 1 year ago. He'd denied himself sleep or shelter, kneeling in the snow, waiting for Mishra or death. It hadn't mattered which. But Meshuval had been correct. Urza had transcended death, and he'd found, to his enduring dismay, that he lacked the will for suicide. A late spring had freed him from his icy prison. He'd stood up, no weaker than he'd been when he'd knelt down. The left side of his face had been raw where bitter tears had leaked from the weak stand, but it had healed quickly within a few moments. He'd walked away with no marks from his season-long penance. In his youth, when his wife's realm of Yosha had still sparkled in the sun, a man named Rusko had told Urza that a Man had many souls throughout his life, and that after death each soul was judged according to its deeds. Urza had outlived his souls. The cilix had blasted him out of Judgment's hands. No penance would ever dull the ache of failure. All that remained was vengeance. Urza had spent the spring and summer assuring himself that Ashnod had not survived. He'd skipped through the plains, returning after each unreal stride to Dominaria in search of a woman who was too proud to change her appearance or her ways. When fall had arrived without a trace of her, Urza had turned his attention to Koilos, where he and Mishra had come to manhood pursuing relics of the Thran. His immortal memory, he discovered, was fallible. Planeswalking couldn't easily take him to a place he didn't quite remember. In the end, searching for places that had faded from memory, he'd been reduced to surveying vast tracts of barren land from the air as he and his brother had surveyed in their youth. He'd have given his eyes and immortality to have back just one of those days he and Mishra had spent in Takashia's camp. Sleety wind shot up his sleeves. Urza wasn't immune to the discomforts of cold, merely to their effects. He thought of a felted cloak. It spread downward from his shoulders, thickening as he added a fur lining, then gloves, fleece-lined boots and a soft-brimmed hat that didn't move in the wind. He continued along the path Mishra's workers had left. As before, and despite his new boots, Urza left no footprints. With each stride, pain ratcheted through his skull. This close to the place where they'd been joined for millennia, his jeweled eyes recalled another purpose. Hoping to dull the pain, Urza turned his back to the cavern. His throbbing eyes saw the snow-etched ruins as shadows painted on gauzy cloth, nothing like the two real visions he'd suffered the day he'd acquired the might stone. Then, the shadows expanded and began to move. They were different from his earlier visions, but not entirely. Where before he had watched white-robed men constructing black metal spiders, now he saw a battlefield swarming with artifacts, another Argoth but without the demonic disorder. At first Urza couldn't distinguish two forces as an observer might not have been able to distinguish his army from Mishra's. But as he looked, the lines of battle became clear. One side had its back against the cavern and was fighting for the freedom of the plains beyond the hollow plateau. The other formed an arc as it emerged from the narrow defile that was the only way to those plains, meaning to crush its enemy against the cliffs. Blinding flashes and plumes of dense smoke erupted everywhere, testaments to the desperation with which both sides fought. Urza strained his eyes. One force had to be the Thran. But which? And what power opposed them? During the moments that Urza pondered, the defile force scored a victory. A swarm of the smaller artifacts stormed the behemoth that anchored the enemy's center. It went down in a whirlwind of flame that drove both forces back. The defile force regrouped quicker and took a bite from the cavern force's precious ground. A Midgard Kadra from the defile brought rays of white light to bear on the behemoth's smoldering hulk. Soot rained and the hulk glowed red. Caught up in the vision, Urza began to count. 1, 2. The hulk's flanks burst, and all too familiar segmented wires uncoiled. Tipped with scythes, the wires slashed through the defile cadre, winnowing it by half, but too late. The Thran power Urstons completed the destruction of the Phyrexian behemoth. Millennia after the battle's dust had settled, Urza clenched his jaws together in a grimly satisfied smile. Ebb and flow were obvious now that he'd identified the Thran, and the goal, to drive the Phyrexians into the cavern, where, presumably, they could be annihilated. It was as the Argoth battle between him and Mishra had been a final battle. Retreat was not an option for the Phyrexians, and the Thran offered no quarter. Urza lost interest in his own time as the shadow war continued. The Phyrexians assembled behind their last behemoth charged the Thran line on its right flank and very nearly broke through. But the Thran held nothing back. As ants might swarm a fallen bit of fruit, they converged upon the Phyrexian bulge. Again, it became impossible to distinguish one force from the other. Urza counted to 110, by which time there was no movement within the shadows. When he reached 112, the shadows brightened to desert noon brilliance. Reflexively, Urza shielded his eyes. When he lowered his hand, there was only snow. The pain in his skull was gone. He entered the cavern thoroughly sobered by what he had seen. His eyes had recorded the final battle between the Thran and the Phyrexians. It seemed reasonable to assume that recording Phyrexian defeats was part of their function. For that assumption, it was easy to conclude that the Thran had intended the recording stones as a warning to all those who came after. Urza had had a vision when he first touched what became his might stone. He recalled it as he entered the cavern. Despite his best efforts, the images were dreamlike, yet they strengthened his newborn conviction the Thran had vanished because they'd sacrificed themselves to defeat the Phyrexians. Within the cavern, Urza gazed up at the rough ceiling. "We didn't know," he explained to any lingering Thran ghosts. "We didn't know your language. We didn't. Guess what we couldn't understand?" He knew now. The artifact in which they'd found the single stone, the artifact that he and Mishra had destroyed, utterly had been the Thran legacy to Dominaria and the means through which they'd locked their enemy out of Dominaria. We didn't know. When the stone had split into its opposing parts, the lock had been sprung and the Phyrexians had returned. The enemy had known better than to approach him, the bearer of the Might Stone, but they must have suborned, corrupted, and destroyed Mishra, who'd had only the weak stone for protection. The stones were not, after all, truly equal. Might was naturally dominant over weakness, as Urza, the elder brother, should have been dominant over the younger, but blinded by an elder brother's prejudice and admit it. Jealousy. Urza had done nothing. No, he'd done worse than nothing. He'd blamed Mishra, gone to war against Mishra, and undone the Thran sacrifice. Guilt was a throbbing presence within Urza's skull. He closed his eyes and clapped his hands over his ears, but that only made everything worse. Why hadn't he and Mishra talked? Through their childhood and youth, he and Mishra had fought constantly and bitterly before repairing the damage with conversation. Then, after the stones had entered into their lives, they hadn't even tried. Then insight and memory came to Urza. There had been one time, about 45 years ago, in what could be called the war's morning hours. They'd come together on the banks of the river Kor, where it tumbled out of the Xantcha mountains. The ocean warlord, his wife's father, had come to Parley with the Qadir of the Phalagi. Urza hadn't seen or heard from his brother for years. He'd believed that Mishra was dead, and had been stunned to see him advising The Qadir. He, Urza gods and ghosts take note, had suggested that they should talk, and Mishra had agreed. As Urza recalled the conversation, Mishra had been reluctant, but that was his brother's style, petulant and sulky whenever his confidence was shaken, as surely it would have been shaken with the Weekton burden slung around his neck, and the Phyrexians eating at his conscience. Surely Mishra would have confessed everything, if the warlord hadn't taken it into his head to assassinate the Qadir as the parley began. Urza recalled the carnage, the look on Mishra's face. Back in Koilos, in the first snows of the 5th winter. After the cataclysm, Urza staggered and eased himself to the ground. For a few moments the guilt was gone, replaced by a cold fury that reached across time to the warlord's neck. It was your fault. Your fault. But the warlord shrugged him away. He was your brother, not mine. If the Phyrexians had not taken Mishra's soul before that day on the banks of the Kor, they had surely had no difficulty afterward. The blame, then, was Urza's, and there was nothing he could do to ease his conscience, except, as always, in vengeance against the Phyrexians. For once, Urza was in the right place. Koilos was where the Thran had stopped the Phyrexians once, and where his own ignorance had given the enemy a second chance. If there was a way to Phyrexia, it was somewhere within Koilos. Urza left tracks in the dust as he searched for a sign. The sun had set. Koilos was tomb dark. Urza's eyes made their own light, revealing a path less dusty than any other that led deep into the cavern's heart. He found a chamber ringed with burnt-out power stones. 2 sooty lines were etched on the sandstone floor. Marks that might have been Thran glyphs showed faintly between the lines. Urza used his eyes to scour the spot, but the glyphs, if glyphs they were, remained illegible. He cursed and knelt before the lines. This was the place. It had to be the very place where the Phyrexians had entered Dominaria. There could be no doubt. Looking straight ahead, past the lines and the exhausted power stones, there was a crystal reliquary atop a waist-high pyramid. The reliquary was broken and empty, but the pyramid presented an exquisitely painted scene to Urza's glowing eyes, the demon he had seen in Tauros' memory. Circling the pyramid, Urza saw 2 other demonic portraits and a picture of the chamber itself with a black disc rising between the etched lines. He tore the chamber apart, looking for the disc, either its substance or the switch that awakened it, and not for the first time in his life, Urza failed. When Urza walked among the multiverse of planes, he began his journey wherever he happened to be and ended it with an act of will or memory. He realized that the Phyrexians had used another way, but it lay beyond his comprehension, as did the plane from which they'd sprung. The multiverse was vast beyond measure and filled with uncountable planes, with no trail or memory to guide him. Urza was a sailor on a becalmed sea, beneath a clouded sky. He had no notion which way to turn. I am immortal. I will wander the plains until I find their home, however long and hard the journey, and I will destroy them as they destroyed my brother. Chapter 2. Nearly 5 years after Argoth was destroyed and the war between the brothers had ended, Tauros came to my courtyard. He told me much that I had never known, much that I have written here. He told me that my husband was dead and that he died with my name on his lips. It is a pretty thought, and I would like to believe it, but I am not certain that Urza died, and if he did, he would have died calling to Mishra, not me. Xantcha lightly brushed her fingertips over brittle vellum before closing her tooled leather cover of the Antiquity Wars. It was the oldest among her copies of Kayla, being Krug's epic history, and the scribe who'd copied and translated it nearly 1200 years earlier claimed he'd had Kayla's original manuscript in front of him. Xantcha had her doubts, if not about the scribe's honesty, then about his gullibility. Not that either mattered. For a tale that had no heroes and a very bitter ending, the Antiquity Wars had been very carefully preserved for nearly 3.5 millennia. It was as if everyone still heeded the warning in Kayla's opening lines, "Let this, the testament of Kayla bin Krug, the last of Yosha, serve as memory, so that our mistakes will never be repeated." Xantcha stared beyond the table. On a good night, the window would have been open and she could have lost her thoughts in the stars twinkling above the isolated cottage. But Dominaria hadn't completely recovered from the unnatural ice age that followed the Brothers' War. Clear nights were rare on Xantcha's side of the Iran ridge, where the cottage was tucked into a crease of land, where the grass ended and the naked mountains began. Mostly, the weather was cool or cold, damp or wet, or something in between. Tonight, gusty winds were propelling needle-sharp sleet against the shutters. The room had cooled while she read. Her breath was mist, and, with a shivering sigh, Xantcha made her way to the peat bin. There were no trees near the cottage. Her meager garden sprouted a new crop of stones every spring, and the crumbling clods that remained after she'd picked out the stones were better suited for the brazier than for nurturing grains and vegetables. She'd had to scrounge distant forests for her table and shutters. Even now that the cottage was finished, she spent much of her time scrounging the remains of treachery for food and rumors, shredding a double handful of peat into the brazier. Beneath the table, Xantcha found, as she often did, the squishy remains of an acorn, a reminder of just how much Urza and his brother had changed their world with their war. When whole, the acorn would have been as large as her fist, and the tree that had dropped it would have had a trunk as broad as the cottage was wide. She crumbed the acorn with the rest and stirred the coals until palpable heat radiated from the iron bucket. Xantcha forgot the table and hit her head hard as she stood. She sat a moment, rubbing her scalp and muttering curses, until she remembered the candlestick. With a louder curse, she scrabbled to her feet. Waste not, want not, it hadn't toppled. Her book was safe. She returned to her stool and opened to a random page. Kayla's portrait stared back at her, dusky, slow-eyed, and seductive. Xantcha owned 4 illustrated copies of the Antiquity Wars. Each one depicted Kayla differently. Her favorite showed Una's wife as a tall, graceful, and voluptuous woman with long blonde hair, but Xantcha knew none of the portraits were accurate. Staring at the shutters, she tried to imagine the face of the woman who had known, and perhaps loved, Urza the artificer while he was a mortal man. One thing was certain, Xantcha didn't resemble Kayla bin Krug. There were no extravagant curves in Xantcha's candlelit silhouette. She was short, not tall, and her hair was a very drab brown, which she cropped raggedly around a face that was more angular than attractive. Xantcha could, and usually did, pass herself off as a slight youth. awaiting his full growth and first beard. Still, Xantcha thought she and Kayla would have been friends. Life had forced many of the same hard lessons down their throats. Kayla, however, wasn't the epic character who intrigued Xantcha most. That honor went to Urza's brother, Mishra. 3 of Xantcha's illustrated volumes depicted Mishra as a whip-lean man with hard eyes. The 4th portrayed him as soft and lazy, like an overfed cat. Neither type matched Kayla's word picture. To Kayla, Mishra had been tall and powerful, with straight black hair worn wild and full. Mishra's smile, his sister-by-law had written, was warm and bright as the sun on midsummer's day, and his eyes sparkled with wit when they weren't flashing full of suspicion. Not all the antiquity wars in Xantcha's collection included Kayla's almost indiscreet portrait of her husband's brother. Some scribes had openly seized an opportunity to take a moral stance, not only against Mishra, but other men of more recent vintage, as if a princess of ancient Yosha could have foreseen the vices of the Samisar of Evin or Ninkan the Bold. One scribe, writing in the year 2657, admitted that she'd omitted the Mishra section entirely, because it was inconsistent with Kayla's loyalty to her husband and therefore a likely fraud and absolutely inappropriate for the education of the young prince, who was expected to learn his statecraft from her copy of the epic. Xantcha wondered if that priggish scribe had seen a picture on her table. The Kayla Bing Krug of Xantcha's oldest copy wore a veil, 3 pearl robes, and very little else. Few men could have resisted her allure. One of them had been her husband. Beyond doubt, Urza had neglected his wife. No woman had ever intrigued Urza half as much as his artifacts. How many evenings might Kayla have gone to bed railing at the fates who'd sent the chaste Urza to her father's palace, rather than his charming brother. Urza had never questioned his wife's fidelity. At least, Xantcha had never heard him raise that question. Then again, the man who lived and worked on the other side of the wall at Xantcha's back had never mentioned his son or grandson either. With a sigh and a yawn, Xantcha stowed the book in a chest that had no lock. They didn't need locks in the absolute middle of nowhere. Urza had the power to protect them from anything. The heavy lid served only to discourage the mice that would otherwise have devoured the vellum. Xantcha. Urza's voice came through the wall as she contemplated the precious library she'd accumulated over the last 2.5 centuries. She leapt instantly to her feet. The lid fell with a bang. Urza had shut himself in his workroom while she'd been off scrounging, and she'd known better than to interrupt him when she'd returned. 16 days had passed since she'd heard his voice. The cottage had 2 rooms, hers, which had begun as a shed around an outdoor bread oven, and Urza's, which consumed everything under the original roof, a dugout, cellar and a storage alcove. Urza traveled light but settled deep. Each room had a door to a common porch whose thatched roof provided some protection from the weather. Wind-driven sleet pelted her as Xantcha darted down the porch. She shoved the door shut behind her, then, when Urza hadn't noticed the sound or draft, took his measure before approaching him. Urza the Great Artificer sat at a high table on a stool identical to her own. By candlelight, Xantcha saw that he was dressed in the same tattered blue tunic he'd been wearing when she'd last seen him. His ash-blonde hair spewed from the thong meant to confine it at the nape of his neck. It wasn't dirty, not the way her hair would have gotten foul if it went that long between washings. Urza didn't sweat or purge himself in any of the usual ways. He didn't breathe when he was wrapped in his studies and never needed to eat, though he spoke in the mortal way and ate heartily. Sometimes, if she'd cooked something that appealed to him, he drank water, never caring where it came from or how long. It had stood stagnant, but the slops bucket beside his door never needed emptying. Urza didn't get tired either, which was a more serious problem because he remained man enough to need sleep and dreams for the purging of his thoughts. There were times when Xantcha believed that all Urza's thoughts needed purging. This was one of them. Mountains rose from Urza's table, all too familiar. Mountains shaped from clay and crockery. Quicksilver streams overflowed the corners as melting sleet trickled down her spine. Xantcha wondered if she could retreat and pretend she hadn't heard. She judged that she could have, but didn't. "I've come," she announced in the language only she and Urza spoke, rooted in ancient Argivian with a leavening of Yoshan and tidbits from 1,000 other worlds. Urza spun quickly on the stool, too quickly for her eyes to follow his movement. Indeed, he hadn't moved, he'd reshaped himself. It was never a good sign when Urza forgot. His body, meeting his eyes, confirmed Xantcha's suspicions. They glowed with their own facet rainbow light. "You summoned me." He blinked and his eyes turned mortal, dark irises within whites clearer. But that was the illusion, the other was real. "Yes, yes. Come see, Xantcha. Look at what has been revealed." She'd sooner have entered the 9th sphere of Phyrexia. Well, perhaps not the 9th sphere, but the 7th. Certainly. Come. Come. It's not like the last time. At least he remembered the last time when the mountains had exploded. Xantcha crossed the narrows of the oblong room until she stood at arm's length from the table. Contrary to his assurance, it was like the last time, exactly like the last time and the time before that. He'd recreated the plane of the river core below the KH ridge and covered the plane with gnats. She kept her distance. "I'm no judge, Urza, but to my poor eyes it looks similar. You must get closer." He offered her a glass lens set in an ivory ring. It might have been seething poison for the enthusiasm with which she took it. He offered her his stool. When that didn't entice her, he grabbed her arm and pulled. Xantcha clambered onto the stool and bent over the table with the glass between her and the gnats. Despite reluctance and reservation, Xantcha let out an awed sigh. As an artificer, Una was incomparable. What had appeared to be nuts were, as she had known they would be, tiny automata, each perfectly formed and unique. In addition to men and women, there were horses, the tails swishing in imperceptible breezes, harnessed to minuscule carts. She didn't doubt that each was surrounded by a cloud of flies that the glass could not resolve. Nothing on the table was alive. Urza was adamant that his artifacts remained within what he called the supreme principle of the Thran. Artifacts were engines in service to life. Never life itself, and never ever sentient. Bright tents pimpled Urza's table landscape. There were even miniature reproductions of the artifacts he and his brother had brought to the place and time that Kayla had called the Dawn of Fire. Xantcha focused her attention on the automata. She found Mishra's shiny dragon engine a ground-bound bumblebee among the gnats and Urza's delicate ornithopters. When Xantcha saw an ornithopter spread its wings and rise above the table, she was confident that she'd seen a reason for Urza's summons. Miniaturizing those early artifacts had been a greater challenge than creating the swarms of tiny men and women who milled around them. "You've got 'em flying." Urza pushed her aside. His eyes required no polished glass assistance. He could most likely see the horseflies, the fleas, and the worms as well. Xantcha noticed that he was frowning. "It's very good," she assured him, fearing that her initial response hadn't been sincere enough. No, you were looking in the wrong place, Xantcha. Look here." He positioned her hands above the largest tent. "What do you see now?" "Blue cloth," she replied, knowing full well that within the tent, automata representing Urza and the major characters of Kayla's epic were midway through a scene she'd observed many times before. At first she'd been curious to see how Urza's script might differ from his wife's, but not anymore. Urza muttered something. It was probably just as well that Xantcha didn't quite catch it, and the blue cloth became a shadow through which the automata could be clearly seen. There was Urza, accurate down to the same blue shirt and threadbare trousers. His master-student Tauros stood nearby, a half-head taller than the rest. The Krug warlord, the Falajikadir, and a score of others, all moving as if they were alive and oblivious to the huge face hovering overhead. Mishra was in the shadowed tent too, but Urza was peculiar about his younger brother's gnat. While all the others had mortal features, Mishra was never more than wisps of metal at the Kadir's side. "Is it the second morning?" Xantcha asked. Urza was breathing down her neck, expecting conversation. She hoped he didn't intend to show her the assassinations. Suffering, even of automata, repelled her. Another grumble from Urza. "Then look for Ashnod." According to the Antiquity Wars, auburn-haired Ashnod wasn't at the dawn of fire, but Urza always made a gnat in her image. He'd put it on the table, where it did nothing except get in the way of the others. To appease her hovering companion, Xantcha moved the glass slightly and found a red-capped dot in the shadow of another tent. "You moved her there?" "Never," Urza roared. His eyes flashed, and the air within the cottage was very still. "I refine my understanding. I do not ever control them. Each time, I create new opportunities for the truth to emerge." "Time." Xantcha, "Time is always the key. I call them moats of time. The tiny moats of time that replay the past, long after events have passed beyond memory. The more I refine my automata, the more of those moats I can attract. Truth attracts truth as time attracts time, Xantcha, and the more moats of time I can attract, the more truth I learn about that day. And finally the truth clings to Ashnod, and she has been drawn out of her lies and deception. Watch as she reveals what I have always suspected." Urza snapped his fingers, and, equally fascinated and repelled, Xantcha watched Ashnod's gnat skulk from shadow to shadow until it was outside the Parley tent, very near Mishra's back. Then the Ashnod gnat knelt and manipulated something. The glass wasn't strong enough to unmask the object, and a tiny spark leaped from her hands. Mishra's wisps and filings glowed green. The illusion of movement and free will was so seamless that Xantcha asked, what did she do? Rather than what did it do? What do you think? Were your eyes open? Were you paying attention? Must I move them backward and do it again? Urza replied. Urza was less tolerant of free will in his companions. Xantcha marveled that Tauros never left him, but perhaps Urza had been less acid-tongued in his mortal days. I don't number. She set the lens on a shelf slung beneath the table. It has never been my place to think. Tell me, and I will stand enlightened. Their eyes locked, and for a moment Xantcha stared into the ancient duels through which Urza interpreted his life. Urza could reduce her to memory, but he blinked first. Proof. Proof at last. Ashnod's the one. I always suspected she was the first the Phyrexians suborned. Urza seized the lens and thrust it back into Xantcha's hands. Now, look at the dragon engine. The oceans have not begun to move against the Qadir, but see, it has already awakened. Ashnod cast her spark upon my brother, and he called to it. It would only respond to him. You know. Xantcha didn't peer through the lens. A blanket of light had fallen across the work table, a hungry blanket that rose into Urza's glowing eyes rather than fell from them. Mishra, Urza whispered. If only you could see me, hear me. I was not there for you then, but I am here for you now. Cast your heart upward and I will open your eyes to the treachery around you. Xantcha didn't doubt Urza's ability, only his sanity. Especially when he started talking to his Nat brother. Urza believed that each moment of time contained every other moment, and that it was possible to not only recreate the past but to reach into it and affect it. Someday, as sure as the sun rose in the east, Urza would talk to the gnats on his table. He'd tell Mishra all the secrets of his heart, and Mishra would answer him. None of it would be the truth, but all of it would be real. Xantcha dreaded that coming day. She set the lens down again and tried to distract Urza with a question. So, your side? Urza focused his eyes, uncanny light on her face. Not my side. I was not a party to anything that happened that day. I was ignorant of everything. They lied to me and deceived me. They knew I would never consent to their treachery. I would have stopped them. I would have warned my brother. Xantcha beat a tactical retreat. Of course. But even if you had, the end would not have changed, she said in her most soothing tone. If you've got it right now, then the warlord's schemes were irrelevant. Through Ashnod, the Phyrexians had their own treachery against the Qadir and the warlord against you and Mishra. None of you were meant to survive. Yes, Urza said on a chord breath. Yes. Exactly. Neither the Qadir nor the warlord were supposed to survive. It was a plot to capture me as they had already captured my brother. Thus he was willing, but also reluctant to talk to me. He turned back to the table. I understand, brother. I forgive. Be strong, Mishra. I will find a way to save you as I saved myself. Xantcha repressed a shudder. There were inconsistencies among her copies of the Antiquity Wars, but none on the scale Urza proposed. Was your brother transformed then, or still flesh? Urza backed away from the table. His eyes were clouded, almost normal in appearance. I will learn that next time. Or the time after that. They have suborned him. See how he responds to Ashnod. She was the first creature they must have known that if we talked privately, I would have sensed the change in him. I would have set him free. If there was still any part of him left that could have been freed, or I would have turned my wrath on him from that point forward. They knew I could not be suborned Xantcha because I possessed their might stone. The stones have equal power Xantcha, but their power is different. The weak stone is weakness, the might stone is strength, and the Phyrexians never dared my strength. The evil that day, Xantcha. If they had not driven us apart, there would have been no war, except against them. You see that, Xantcha? You see that, don't you? My brother and I together would have driven them back to Koilos. They knew our power before we'd begun to guess it. They had them. With Urza, it all came back to them Phyrexians. Xantcha knew the Phyrexians for the enemies they were. She'd never argue that they hadn't played a pivotal role in Urza's wars. Perhaps they had suborned Mishra and Ashnod too. But while Urza played with nuts on a tabletop, another wave of Phyrexians, real Phyrexians, had washed up on Dominaria's shores. It makes no difference, she protested. Mishra's been dead for more than 3,000 years. It hardly matters whether you failed him, or Ashnod destroyed him, or the Phyrexians suborned him, or whether it happened before the dawn of fire, or after. Urza, you're creating a past that doesn't matter. They took my brother from me, and made of him my greatest enemy. It matters, Xantcha. It will always matter more than anything else. I must learn what they did and how and when they did it. He breathed a slow sigh. I could have stopped him. I must not fail again. He held his hands above the table. Xantcha didn't need the lens to know that Mishra's nat shone bright. I won't. Mishra. I will never fail again. I have learned caution. I have learned deception. I will not be tricked, not even by you. Before Urza had brought Xantcha to Dominaria, she'd been more sympathetic to his guilt-driven obsessions. Now, she said, not even you can change the past, and didn't care if he struck her down for impudence. Are you going to stand by and play with toys while the Phyrexians steal your birthplace from you? They're back. I smelled them in Bazarat and Morven. The Bazarati and the Morvenish are at war with each other, just as the Yotians and the Phalagi were, and the Phyrexians are on both sides. Sound familiar? Her neck ached from staring up at him and braving his gemstone stare. Xantcha had no arcane power to draw upon, but nose to nose, she was more stubborn. Why are we here? She asked in the breathless silence. If you're not going to take a stand against the Phyrexians, we could play games anywhere. Urza retreated. He moistened his lips and made other, merely mortal gestures. Not games, Xantcha. I can afford no more mistakes. Dominaria has not forgotten or forgiven what happened last time. I must tread lightly. So many died, so much was destroyed, and all because I was blind and deaf. I did not see that my brother was not himself, that he was surrounded by enemies. I didn't hear his pleas for help. He never pled for help. That's why you didn't hear. And you can never know why he didn't, because you can never talk to him again. No matter what happens in this room, on that table, you can't bring him back. Now you've got Ashnod outside the tent. You've made her into another Phyrexian, pulling Mishra's strings. The oceans were planning an ambush, the Phyrexians were planning an ambush, and you weren't wise to either plot. Waste not, want not, Urza. If the Phyrexians had Ashnod before the dawn of fire, how did she manage 30 years later to send Tauros to you with a cilix? Or was that part of a plot too? A complete Phyrexian doesn't have a conscience, Urza. A complete Phyrexian doesn't feel remorse, he can't. Mishra never did. He couldn't. He'd been suborned, Urza shouted. Usurped. Corrupted. Destroyed. He was no longer a man when I faced him in Argoth. They'd taken his will, flensed his flesh and stretched it over an abomination. But they didn't take Ashnod's will. She sent, though. Cilix. Was her will stronger than your brother's? Xantcha played a dangerous game herself and played it to the brink. Urza had frozen, no blinking or breathing, as if he'd become an artifact himself. Xantcha pressed her advantage. Was Ashnod stronger than you two? Strong enough to double deal the Phyrexians and save Dominaria in the only way she could? No, Urza whispered. No. No, what, Urza? Once you start treating bomb men and women as Phyrexians, where do you stop? Ashnod skulking outside your tent before the dawn of fire, Ashnod sending Tauros with the cilix. One time she's a Phyrexian puppet. The next she's not. Are you sure you know which is which? Or maybe she was the puppet both times, and what would that make you? You used the cilix. Urza folded a fist. Stop, he warned. The Phyrexians spent 3,000 years trying to say you before they gave up. I think they gave up because they'd found a better way. Leave you alone on a mountainside playing with toys. He'd have been a powerful man if muscle and bone had been his strength's only source, but Urza had the power of the Thran through his eyes, and the power of a sorcerer. Standing on his native ground, his arm began to move. As long as she could see it moving, Xantcha believed she was safe. The fist touched her hair and stopped. Xantcha held her breath. He'd never come that close, never actually touched her before. They couldn't go on like this, not if there was any hope for Dominaria. Urza, she whispered when at last her lungs demanded air. Urza, can you hear me? Do you see me? Xantcha touched his arm. Urza. Urza, talk to me. He trembled and grabbed her shoulder for balance. He didn't know his strength. Pain left her gasping. Her eyes were shut when he made the transition, temporary or even at the best of times, back into the here and now. Something happened to Urza when he cast his power over the work table. Not the truth, but definitely real and definitely getting worse. Xantcha, his hand sprang away from her as though she were made from red-hot metal. Xantcha, what is this? He stared at the crockery mountains as if he'd never seen them before, though Xantcha had seen even that reaction more times than she cared to remember. You summoned me, Urza, she said flatly. You had something new to show me. But this. He gestured at his mountain and gnat-covered table. Where did this come from? Not me. Not again. She nodded. I was sitting on the porch as the sun set. It was quiet, peaceful. I thought of the past. Xantcha, and it began again. He shrank within himself. You weren't here. I was after food. You were inside when I returned. Urza, you've got to let go of the past. It's not healthy. Even for you, this is not healthy. They stared at each other. This had happened so many times before that there was no longer a need for conversation. Even the moment when Urza swept everything off his table was entirely predictable. It started, Urza, truly it started. This time there's a war south of here, Xantcha said, while dust still rose from the crumbled mountains. Quicksilver slithered across the packed dirt floor, and gnats by the hundred scrambled for shelter. Phyrexians. I ken them on both sides. Sleepers. They take orders, they don't give them, but it's a dominarian war. With Phyrexian interference on both sides. He took the details directly from her mind, a painless process when she cooperated. Bazarat and Morven. I do not know these names. They aren't mighty kingdoms with glorious histories. They're little more than walled cities, a few villages, and, to keep the grudge going, a handful of gold mines in the hills between them, something for the Phyrexians to exploit. They're getting bolder. Bazarat and Morven aren't the only places I've centered glistening oil in the wind, but this is the first war. You haven't interfered. His voice harshened and his eyes flashed. With Urza, madness was never more than a moment away. You said I mustn't, and I obey. You should look for yourself. Now is the time. Perhaps. I dare not move too soon. The land remembers. There can be no mistakes. I must have cause. I must be very careful, Xantcha. If I reveal myself too soon, I foresee disaster. We must weigh our choices carefully. Retorts swirled in Xantcha's mind. It was never truly we with Urza, but she'd made her choices long ago. No one will suspect, even if you used your true name and shape. There have been a score of doom-saying Urza's on the road this year alone. You've become the stuff of legends. No one would believe you're you. A rare smile lit up her companion's face. That bad. Still. Worse. But please, go to Bazarat and Morven. A quarrel has become a war. So it began with the Phalange and the oceans. Who knows, there might be brothers. You've been up here too long, Urza. Urza reached into her mind again, gathering landmarks and languages, which she willingly surrendered. Then, in a blink's time, she was back into her own proper consciousness. Urza faded into the between worlds, which was, among other things, the fastest way to travel across the surface of a single world. Good luck, she wished him, then knelt down. Crashing crockery had crushed a good many of Urza's gnats. Quicksilver had dissolved uncounted others. Yet many swirled around in confusion on the floor. Xantcha labored until midnight, gathering them into a box no deeper than her finger, but far too steep for any of them to climb. When the dirt was motionless, she took the box into the alcove where Urza stored his raw materials. The shelves were neat. Every casket and flask was clearly labeled, albeit in a language Xantcha couldn't read. She didn't need to read labels. The flask she wanted had a unique lambent glow. It was pure floaten, distilled from fire, starlight and mana, a recipe Urza had found on the world where he'd found Xantcha. Waste not, want not, she whispered over the seething box. The gnats blazed like fireflies as they fell through the floatin, and then were gone. Xantcha resealed the flask and replaced it on the shelf exactly as she'd found it before returning to her own room. She had a plan of her own, which she'd promised herself she'd implement when the time was right. That time had come when Urza touched her hair. If Urza couldn't see the present Phyrexian threat, because he was obsessed with the past. If he couldn't care about the folk of Bazarat or Morvam because he still cared too much about what had happened to Mishra, then Xantcha figured she had to bring the past and Mishra to Urza. She had it all worked out in her mind, as much as she ever worked anything out. Find a young man who resembled Kayla's word picture, teach him the answers to Urza's guilty questions, then troll her trumped-up Mishra past Urza's eyes. A new Mishra wouldn't cure his madness. Nothing could do that, not while those power-stone eyes were lodged in Urza's skull. But if a false Mishra could convince Urza to walk away from his work table, that would be enough.